Speculators are to blame. I'll give you an example. In Florida last year, 2007, 90% of all condos were purchased by people who had no intention of ever living in the condo. They bought the condo with the idea of holding it a couple, 3 months, then flipping it at a higher price. Too much cable television, right? Flip that house. That's a bad program, doggone it. So they bought the condos, not because they wanted to live there. They already had a place to live. The idea was hold it for just a little while, flip it at a 10 or 15% increase. Well, the bubble broke in July 2007, and the speculators not only couldn't flip them, they couldn't sell it to anybody, and they couldn't pay back the mortgage. And that's why Florida is one of the hardest hit states in the U.S. right now. Thanks a lot. Bond rating agencies are to blame. Bond rating agencies are companies whose expertise is to rate bonds as to how risky they are. And they ended up rating these bonds with all the mortgages as collateral. The companies are Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. Ever hear of Fitch? It's just in the news over the weekend, downgrading National City. They assume the same minuscule historical default rates on mortgages as had existed for decades. You could say, well, you know, why isn't that a bad idea? If the rate is minuscule for decade after decade, why won't that hold in the future? It's because decade after decade, subprime mortgages were 2% of the total. By last year, they were 30%. That's a good reason not to assume the same less than 1% default rate. They didn't know what they were doing, the rating agencies. So they gave those bonds AAA rating, the very highest rating, and that was a signal to everybody around the globe. These are great bonds, they're backed by U.S. mortgages. What can go wrong? Well, Wall Street firms here in the U.S. bought those toxic bonds. Europeans bought them, and the Chinese especially bought them. Because the Chinese have a lot of money that we're sending over. They have a lot of dollars. We buy a lot of stuff from China. They bought a huge proportion of those bad bonds. Maybe you saw in the news. I thought it was kind of curious the first time I saw it. People in Hong Kong were rioting out in the streets. And I thought, oh no, what's going on? They were rioting against the AAA mortgage bonds issued by Fannie and Freddie that were in default and had cleaned them out. Global presence. Now you could say, oh, that serves the Chinese right. Right, it's a dog-eat world, dog-eat-dog world out there, except for one thing. Once burned, next time cautious. It might be a while before we see that Chinese money coming back into the U.S. economy. That's a good thing for their money to come back here. Bond insurers are to blame. Bond insurers are companies that will look at a bond issue, a potential bond issue, and say, we'll insure that. If the issuing company goes under, we'll pay the interest and we'll pay back the principal. They also assumed the same minuscule default rates, and when all these bonds started defaulting, the insurers were wiped out. So now the insurance doesn't mean anything. So buying a bond of any type with insurance used to mean something to investors. Brokers would say, oh, this is AAA rated. And the investor would say, good, I'll buy it. Now it's AAA rated, but we don't know what that means. Uncertainty is bad. Wall Street is to blame for a lot of reasons. Wall Street is to blame because of their high expenses. Back in 1978, the late 70s, the junk bond king, who was that? Michael Milken. He was paid $550 million in 1 year. That's what he was paid. That was more than his firm earned, but that was his agreement. And his Wall Street firm said, well, we drew up that contract with Michael way back years ago when we hired him, and that's his bonus. That's what he gets. Well, what kind of industry pays $550 million and they think that's okay? He's the exception. That was a huge payout, but still the top X number of executives out there working for Wall Street firms. They got millions of dollars of bonuses every year and very high salaries. And I know they work very hard, but it's not the NBA. You've got to earn your money. They also loaned out anywhere from $30 to $40 for every dollar of capital they had. Capital is cushion. They loaned out $30 to $40 per dollar of capital. When their capital was wiped out, just say $1 is wiped out, $30 to $40 of their loans, they can't do anymore. And they can't sell anything if there's no market. With financial markets collapsing, there's no market. Wall Street firms lost billions and billions. And as a result, there's no Wall Street anymore as we knew it. There's no Goldman Sachs. There's no Bear Stearns. There's no Lehman Brothers. There's no, who am I leaving out here? Yeah. There's no Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch is now a bank. There's one more.
AIG, sure.
AIG was a big insurance company, global financial giant. Well, you get the idea. The 5 largest dominant firms on Wall Street, they're gone. Lehman failed. The others are banks. That's the end of them. Banks, on the other hand, lend $10 on average for every dollar of capital. So you could say, I mean, just the algebra, they're 3 to 4 times more conservative than Wall Street firms. The Wall Street firms change themselves into banks by being acquired by banks. So Goldman Sachs voluntarily changed itself into a bank holding company. Safer. Now they can borrow money from the government, from the Federal Reserve System, through the banking system, whereas they couldn't really before. I've already mentioned that lenders, the banks, are to blame. The banks and other lenders, not only for putting pressure from top to bottom, just make mortgages. We don't care to whom you make the mortgage. We don't care if there's no income. Don't ask, don't tell. We'll sell the mortgage to Freddie and Fannie. Some investor in China will buy it. Is this a great country or what? With that kind of system, it's no wonder we made all these subprime loans. But the sheer silliness of lending to someone with no job or inadequate income, I don't care who'd buy it, that's just silly too. Congress is to blame for several reasons. The House is to blame for arguing about blame. Who do we blame for all this instead of passing the bailout several days ago, last week, Monday, when they had the chance? More of the House got on fire. That's the way I see it. Congress is also to blame for severely underfunding the Securities and Exchange Commission. I think the SEC's budget is less than it was 20 years ago, in spite of inflation. The SEC's job is to check on Wall Street firms. They're supposed to audit them periodically, and something like only 35 firms were audited last year out of 100 and maybe 70. It should be every firm every year. So Congress has severely underfunded the SEC. Also, the Securities and Exchange Commission had advance notice a year beforehand, before Lehman Brothers failed. There was all sorts of information coming out that Lehman was in severe trouble. The SEC did nothing. And why didn't they do anything? I'm sure they didn't have the staff to do it. When Senator McCain said, "You elect me president, I'll fire the chairman of the SEC," my initial thought was, well, that's a ludicrous statement. But having read articles about what was going on at the SEC, I don't know, maybe that's not so ludicrous. You always get rid of the person at the top when the problems seem endemic from top to bottom. I'm not saying he deserves to be fired, but give someone else a chance. How's that?